Day 8, November 19th, 1863. Shall not perish. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On a horse that's a bit too small for his great height, Abraham Lincoln slowly rides towards Gettysburg Cemetery Hill, trailed by an entourage that includes several governors, dozens of army officers, and members of Congress, and a few of his cabinet officers. A few months earlier, on the same spot, Union and Confederate armies fought for 3 days, leaving the largest number of casualties of any battle during the war. 30,000 men were wounded, and 7,000 dead men are scattered throughout the fields in and around Gettysburg. Simply burying that many dead was a difficult task. To prevent the rotting corpses from spreading disease, many of the men were buried in shallow graves where they had fallen. But some of the townspeople of Gettysburg are determined that these soldiers should have more of a fitting memorial, and on this day, an area of the hill near the town cemetery is being dedicated to the Union war dead. The soldiers who fought for the Confederacy were left in their original graves until a few years after the war ended. Eyes on the prize. The Battle of Gettysburg, which took place from July 1st through July 3rd, 1863, is often called a turning point in the war. Up to that point, the armies of the Confederacy had been winning most of the important battles, especially in the east near Washington, D.C. Robert E. Lee, in command of the rebel army of Northern Virginia, decided to invade the North, marching his 80,000 men across the border into Maryland and then into southern Pennsylvania. He hoped that by bringing the fighting to the North, he could lead politicians there to give up the war. When he met the Union Army at Gettysburg, an even greater prize seemed possible. Defeat of the Union Army would leave Washington, less than 80 miles to the south, underdefended. But the Union Army held its ground, and by the third day, Lee's defeated forces were retreating as quickly as they could. Had the Union commander, General George Meade, advanced on Lee's retreating army, he might have finished the Confederacy. But not only did he fail to advance quickly at the end of the battle, he ignored an opportunity when Lee's army was trapped on the banks of the flooding Potomac River, which was impossible to cross. Perhaps he was unsure of himself, having gained command of the Union troops just 3 days before the battle, when he replaced another general. Lincoln, who knew that Gettysburg could have meant the end of the war rather than just a turning point, was disappointed. Under the photo on page 106, part of the audience at Gettysburg. 3 little words. Reaching the cemetery site, Lincoln steps onto the raised wooden platform about 4 or 5 feet high that has been built for the occasion. A flag has been draped across the front of the platform. 10,000 people, maybe more, have gathered for the ceremony. After Lincoln settles into a chair in the front row on the stage, Edward Everett, the most popular public speaker of the day, begins a 2-hour performance, all of it from memory, describing the great battle that took place 4.5 months earlier. It's a speech that he has written and even published weeks before the event, but Lincoln, who was sent a copy and is prepared for its length, does his best to look attentive. Lincoln has been drafting and revising his remarks for a few weeks, but they remain, as he told one friend, short, short, short. Various people on the trip have been making revisions on the train ride to Gettysburg. He was still making changes just before going to bed the evening before the speech. As Everett's long speech performance continues, Lincoln takes the speech out of his pocket and looks at it once again, almost as if he were ready to revise it on the spot. But he puts it back in his pocket and waits patiently. About Everett's speech, a reporter later said, "So cold. If only it were alive." Finally, Everett finishes, and the crowd seems more exhausted than excited. Now Lincoln stands. As a young eyewitness later put it, the flutter and motion of the crowd ceased the moment the president was on his feet. Such was the quiet that his footfalls, I remember very distinctly, woke echoes, and with the creaking of the boards, it was as if one were walking through the hallways of an empty house. In a sense, that's exactly what Lincoln had been doing for years. Despite being the man at the center of one of the largest conflicts in the history of the world, he remains, as he has felt for much of his life, alone with his thoughts. He knows that the dead men being honored went into battle on his orders. He knows that the war might have ended before the Battle of Gettysburg if it had been better directed. He also knows that many of the soldiers who died felt a great personal loyalty to him, even if they did not agree with all the reasons for the war. He has spent so much time on these short remarks because he wants to honor the war dead with an honest statement about the cause for which they died. For Lincoln, it comes down to the same few words that had been his guiding light since he was a child. All men are created equal. Ending slavery was one part of living up to that ideal, but there was something else. The war was also a test of democracy. It had been less than 100 years since American independence, and self-government was still rare in the world. Europe was still ruled by monarchies. Many people still considered the United States to be an experiment rather than a lasting nation, an experiment that would probably fail. Lincoln puts on his glasses and begins to express his powerful, simple beliefs. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. The Civil War has gone beyond a battle for freedom and equality for slaves. It's become a test of the principle of equality for all Americans who have claimed the right to self-government and now must govern themselves wisely. Early in the war, Lincoln said to his personal secretary, John Hay, "The central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity that it is upon us, of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves." That is what he tells the crowd this day. They must dedicate themselves to the idea for which so many lives were lost, so that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from earth. Under the photo on page 111. In the background of this photo from the ceremony, officials in tall formal hats and others wearing sashes across their chests can be seen on the podium that elevates them slightly above the audience. The figure in the circle has recently been identified as Lincoln. He's in a chair in the front row of the podium and seems to be looking at his lap, possibly reviewing his speech. For a moment, the crowd is silent. After Everett's long speech, they don't believe the president is really finished after fewer than 300 words. Even when he returns to his seat, a young reporter who expected much more asks Lincoln, "Is that all?" "Yes, for the present," Lincoln answers. Ironically, Edward Everett is one of the few who immediately sees the speech's brilliance. He later sends the president a short note. "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." The Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether the nation or any other nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who died here, that the nation might live. This we may, in all propriety, do, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have hallowed it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, while it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us, the living, we here be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that, from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they are here. Gave the last full measure of devotion, that we are highly resolved these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. This text is what's known as the Nicolay version of the speech, one of the few that exist, and may be the closest to what Lincoln read at the ceremony, though later revisions are often taught.